don't scroll just yet. This story might be exactly what you didn't know you needed. Like, subscribe, and let's dive in. I heard screams in the forgotten Montreal tunnels at night. The sound still echoes in my dreams sometimes. A raw, primal scream that seemed to claw its way through tons of concrete and steel to reach me 3 stories underground. It's been 18 months since that night in the forgotten tunnels beneath Montreal, and I still can't walk past a subway grate without feeling my chest tighten. People tell me it was just the wind, or maybe settling infrastructure, or the acoustics playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I heard down there in the dark. And worse, I know it heard me too. My name is Marcus Delacroix, and I've spent the better part of 15 years documenting Montreal's hidden urban infrastructure. What started as a photography hobby in college became an obsession, then eventually a modest living through my blog, Beneath the Surface, and the occasional magazine feature. I've crawled through storm drains, explored abandoned metro stations, and mapped forgotten maintenance corridors that most city officials don't even know exist. Montreal is a city built in layers, the modern metropolis sitting atop centuries of buried history, connected by a labyrinth of tunnels, passages, and forgotten spaces that stretch for miles beneath our feet. The underground city, what we locals call the Réseau, is just the tip of the iceberg. Everyone knows about those climate-controlled shopping corridors that connect downtown buildings. But beneath even those well-traveled paths lies something else entirely. A network of older tunnels, some dating back to the early 1900s, others carved during World War II for purposes that were never fully documented. Over the decades, as the city expanded upward, these lower levels were gradually abandoned, sealed off, and eventually forgotten by everyone except urban explorers like myself and the occasional maintenance worker who might stumble across an old access point. I'd been planning the expedition for months. My research had uncovered references to a section of tunnels in Old Montreal that connected to the original pneumatic postal system, a fascinating piece of infrastructure that once moved mail beneath the city at incredible speeds using compressed air. The system was decommissioned in the 1960s, but the tubes and service tunnels remained, forming a hidden network that I suspected connected to some of the wartime passages I'd been tracking. The access point I'd identified was in the basement of a century-old building on St. Paul Street that was undergoing renovation. The construction crew had exposed a section of wall that revealed a bricked-up archway, and through some creative networking with a sympathetic contractor named Jean-Luc, I'd arranged for a late-night visit to investigate before they sealed it up permanently. November in Montreal comes with a bite that cuts straight through to your bones, and that particular night was no exception. A light snow was falling as I made my way through Old Montreal's cobblestone streets, my camera bag and exploration gear weighing heavy on my shoulders. The tourist crowds had long since retreated indoors, leaving the historic district to the wind and the occasional late-night bar patron stumbling home. My breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as I located the building and made my way around to the service entrance Jean-Luc had left unlocked. The basement smelled of sawdust and damp concrete. Construction lights hung from temporary fixtures, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance with every small vibration of the building above. I found the exposed archway exactly where Jean-Luc had described it, a perfect stone arch that had been carefully bricked up decades ago, now partially open where the renovation work had chipped away the modern cement. I squeezed through the gap, my flashlight beam piercing the darkness beyond. The tunnel stretched ahead of me, wider than I'd expected, easily 6 feet tall and nearly as wide. The walls were lined with the same gray stone as the archway, but here and there I could see evidence of more recent modifications. Metal brackets that once held pipes, electrical conduits that disappeared into the darkness, and every 20 feet or so, recessed alcoves that might have once housed equipment or served as junction points for the pneumatic system. The air was stale but not unbreathable, suggesting some form of ventilation that was still functioning, even if minimally. I began taking photographs, documenting the architecture and the various modifications that had been made over the decades. The tunnel continued straight for about 100 meters before branching into a T-junction. According to my research, the right branch should lead toward the old port area, while the left would curve back toward what is now the financial district. I chose the left branch, following my compass and keeping careful notes of my route. The tunnel here was slightly different. The stone gave way to brick, and the ceiling was supported by steel I-beams that looked like they'd been installed sometime in the 1940s. Occasionally, I'd pass other branching passages, some sealed with modern concrete barriers, others simply blocked by debris or standing water. It was about 45 minutes into my exploration, as I was documenting what appeared to be a ventilation shaft that connected to the surface, that I first heard it. Not the scream, that would come later. This was something subtler, a sound like whispered conversation, so faint I initially dismissed it as the building settling or air moving through the tunnels. But as I stood perfectly still, holding my breath and straining to listen, I realized the sound had a rhythm to it. Like voices, but too distant and distorted to make out any words. The acoustics in the tunnels were strange. Sounds seemed to travel in unexpected ways, bouncing off walls and mixing with echoes until their origin became impossible to determine. I followed the sound, turning down a passage I hadn't planned to explore. This tunnel was different from the others, narrower, with walls that showed evidence of more recent activity. There were scratches in the concrete, and here and there, I found debris that didn't belong to the historical infrastructure: cigarette butts, food wrappers, and what looked like the remains of makeshift sleeping areas. Someone had been using these tunnels, and recently. The whispered voices grew slightly louder as I proceeded, though they remained maddeningly indistinct. I began to feel a creeping unease that I tried to rationalize away. Montreal's homeless population sometimes sought shelter in unusual places during the brutal winters, and it wouldn't be unprecedented to find people living in the underground spaces. But something about the quality of the voices bothered me. They seemed too organized, too purposeful. I was so focused on the sound ahead that I almost missed the branching passage to my right. My flashlight beam swept across the opening as I passed, illuminating something that made me stop dead in my tracks and backtrack for a closer look. The walls of this side passage were covered in markings. Not graffiti, though there was some of that too, but something more deliberate. Symbols had been carved into the concrete, some with tools, others that looked like they might have been scratched with fingernails. They weren't random scratches or casual vandalism. They formed patterns, repeated motifs that suggested meaning, purpose, maybe even a kind of desperate communication. And they were everywhere, covering the walls from floor to ceiling, extending as far as my flashlight beam could reach into the darkness of the passage. I raised my camera to document the markings, but as I did, the whispering voices suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt oppressive, like the weight of the entire city pressing down on the tunnel around me. I stood frozen, finger hovering over the camera's shutter button, afraid that even that small sound might attract unwanted attention. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were coming from somewhere ahead of me in the main tunnel, moving at a deliberate pace. Not the hurried shuffle of someone trying to find shelter, but the measured gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Someone who belonged down here in ways that I clearly did not. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall of the symbol-covered passage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by a sound I couldn't immediately identify, a rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged along the concrete floor. A faint light began to flicker against the tunnel walls, growing brighter as its source approached my position. Not the steady beam of a flashlight, but the wavering glow of a candle or oil lamp. Whoever was coming was in no hurry to hide their presence. I held my breath as the light reached the intersection where I was hiding. Through the gap between the wall and my pressed body, I could see a figure pass by the mouth of the side passage. The light illuminated them for just a moment, but it was enough to see that they were wearing some kind of dark, hooded garment that obscured their features completely. The scraping sound, I realized, was coming from something they were pulling behind them, a canvas sack or bundle that left a wet trail on the concrete floor. The figure paused directly in front of my hiding place. For a terrifying moment, I thought they had detected my presence, but then they continued on, disappearing around a bend in the main tunnel. The sound of their passage faded, leaving me alone once again with the oppressive silence. I waited a full 10 minutes before switching my flashlight back on, and even then I kept it pointed at the ground, using just enough light to navigate. Every instinct told me to retreat, to head back the way I had come and forget about this particular exploration. But the researcher in me, the part that had driven me to spend 15 years documenting the city's hidden spaces, wouldn't let me leave without understanding what I had witnessed. I followed the main tunnel in the direction the figure had gone, moving as quietly as possible and pausing frequently to listen. The wet trail they had left behind gleamed in my flashlight beam, dark stains that I tried not to think too hard about. The tunnel began to curve, and I could see that it opened into a larger space ahead. As I approached, I became aware of a new sound, a low humming, almost like chanting, but with an undertone that seemed to vibrate through the concrete itself. And there was light ahead, not the artificial glare of electric bulbs, but the warm, flickering glow of many candles. I reached the edge of the larger space and carefully peered around the corner. What I saw there still haunts me, still makes me question everything I thought I knew about the city I had spent so many years exploring. The chamber was vast, clearly part of some older infrastructure that predated even the pneumatic postal system. Stone columns supported a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow above the reach of the candlelight. And throughout the space, arranged in careful patterns that reminded me of the symbols I had seen carved into the walls, were dozens of candles, their flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose. But it wasn't the architecture or even the candles that made my blood freeze. It was the people. There were perhaps 30 of them, all wearing the same dark, hooded garments I had seen on the figure in the tunnel. They stood in concentric circles around something in the center of the chamber, and they were humming, that low, vibrating sound that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. As I watched, they began to move, a slow, shuffling dance that maintained their circular formation while rotating around the central focus. And in the center, illuminated by a ring of larger candles, was a stone altar. Ancient-looking, covered in the same symbols I had seen throughout the tunnels. And on that altar, I couldn't make out the details from my position, but I could see that something was lying there. Something that had roughly the size and shape of a human body, covered by a dark cloth. And as the hooded figures continued their ritual dance, I began to realize that the wet trail I had followed wasn't just moisture from the damp tunnels. That's when one of them looked up and saw me. Even from across the chamber, even in the uncertain candlelight, I could see the moment when their gaze found mine. They stopped moving, stopped humming, and simply stared. And then, without any visible signal passing between them, every other figure in the chamber turned to look in my direction. I ran. I had never run so fast in my life, and certainly not through the pitch-black labyrinth of tunnels that suddenly felt like they were closing in around me. Behind me, I could hear them coming, not the measured footsteps of before, but the rapid patter of many feet hitting concrete in unison. They moved through the darkness with a coordination that spoke of intimate familiarity with these passages, while I stumbled and crashed against walls, my flashlight beams swinging wildly as I desperately tried to retrace my route. The sound of my own breathing seemed impossibly loud in the narrow tunnel, mixing with the echo of pursuit to create a cacophony that filled my head and made it nearly impossible to think clearly. I tried to remember the turns I had made, the landmarks I had noted, but panic had a way of scrambling memory. Every branching passage looked the same in the dancing beam of my flashlight, every stone archway and concrete barrier blending together into an endless maze of gray. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps maintaining that eerie synchronization even as they ran. But worse than the sound of pursuit was what accompanied it, a low keening that seemed to come from multiple throats, rising and falling like some kind of hunting call. It wasn't human, couldn't be human, yet I knew it was coming from the hooded figures I had seen in the chamber. My lungs burned as I reached what I hoped was the T-junction where I had made my original choice to go left. In the chaos of flight, I had to stop for a crucial second to orient myself, and that's when I heard the sound that has haunted every quiet moment since that night. A scream. Not the keening of my pursuers, but something else entirely, a raw, agonized shriek that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the tunnels ahead of me. It was human, undeniably human, filled with pain and terror and something else that I couldn't identify at the time, but have since come to recognize as the sound of complete despair. The scream was cut short abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. And in that silence, I realized I could no longer hear the footsteps of my pursuers. I stood frozen at the junction, chest heaving, trying to decide which way to run. The right branch led toward the port area, territory I hadn't explored and that might offer more places to hide, but also more opportunities to become lost. The left branch would take me back toward the route I knew, back toward Jean-Luc's building and safety, but it was also the direction from which that terrible scream had come. As I hesitated, I became aware of a new sound, a wet, sliding noise that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. Like something heavy being dragged across the concrete, but multiplied, as if several somethings were being moved simultaneously through different parts of the tunnel network. I chose the right branch. The tunnel here was different from the others I had explored, older, with walls that showed signs of much more recent modification. Metal brackets held modern LED fixtures that weren't currently powered, and I could see the ghostly outlines where newer concrete had been used to seal off various openings. Someone had been working down here, and recently. About 50 meters down this new passage, I came across something that made me stop despite my desire to keep running. An opening in the wall that had been carefully concealed behind what looked like a movable panel. It was only visible because the panel had been left slightly ajar, revealing a narrow passage beyond that was lit by a faint, bluish glow. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to keep running, to find my way back to the surface and forget everything I had seen. But the explorer in me, the part that had driven me into these tunnels in the first place, needed to know what was behind that panel. And more practically, the sounds of whatever was happening in the main tunnels suggested that my pursuers weren't giving up the chase. I needed somewhere to hide until I could figure out a safe route to the surface. I slipped through the gap and found myself in a passage that was clearly much more recent construction than anything else I had seen. The walls were smooth concrete, and the floor was level and clean. The blue light came from modern LED strips that ran along the ceiling, powered by cables that disappeared into the walls at regular intervals. This wasn't abandoned infrastructure. This was active, maintained, and very much in use. The passage curved gently to the right, and as I followed it, I began to hear sounds from ahead, not the ritual chanting from the chamber I had fled, but something more mundane. The hum of ventilation systems, the distant beep of electronic equipment, and what sounded like normal conversation conducted in low voices. I should have turned back then. Should have found another hiding place, waited until dawn, and then made my way to the surface to pretend none of this had ever happened. But I was too deep now, too committed to understanding what I had stumbled into. And truthfully, despite my terror, I was fascinated. The passage opened into a small anteroom that looked like something from a modern office building. Clean walls, industrial carpeting, and a desk with multiple computer monitors displaying what looked like security camera feeds. The screens showed various views of tunnel passages, including several that I recognized from my exploration. They had been watching me from the moment I entered their domain. But the desk was empty, and the room beyond, visible through a glass partition, appeared to be unoccupied as well. I could see banks of computer servers, wall-mounted displays showing what looked like building schematics and tunnel maps, and equipment that I couldn't immediately identify but that looked expensive and sophisticated. I approached the desk carefully, trying to make sense of what I was seeing on the security monitors. One screen showed the chamber where I had witnessed the ritual, but now it was empty except for the ring of candles, still burning around the central altar. Another monitor displayed a view of the main tunnel where I had encountered the hooded figure with the canvas sack. The trail of dark stains was still visible on the concrete floor. But it was the third monitor that made my blood run cold. It showed a passage I didn't recognize, lit by harsh fluorescent lights, where several figures in modern clothing, not the ritualistic robes I had seen before, were working around what appeared to be a medical examination table. The image quality was high enough that I could see they were wearing surgical masks and gloves, and they were working on something that lay motionless on the table. I was so focused on the monitors that I almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching from the passage behind me. Not the synchronized running of my earlier pursuers, but the normal gait of someone walking with purpose. I looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the room was too open, too exposed. The only option was to retreat deeper into the facility, through the glass partition and into the computer room beyond. The door was unlocked. I slipped through just as I heard voices in the anteroom, 2 people speaking in rapid French, their words too quick and too muffled for me to follow completely. But I caught enough to understand that they were discussing my presence in the tunnels, and that they were not pleased about it. The computer room was larger than it had appeared from the anteroom, extending back into shadows that my flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. Banks of servers hummed quietly, their status lights blinking in patterns that suggested heavy processing loads. The wall-mounted displays showed more detailed versions of the tunnel maps I had glimpsed from the anteroom, with overlays that marked various locations with symbols and annotations in multiple languages. But it was the photographs that covered one entire wall that finally helped me understand what I had stumbled into. They were surveillance photos, clearly taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions. Dozens of them, showing people entering and leaving various buildings throughout Montreal. But these weren't random citizens. Each photo was annotated with notes in small, precise handwriting. Names, addresses, daily routines, and what looked like psychological profiles. And in the center of the wall, connected to the other photos by red string in a pattern that suggested some kind of organizational chart, was a photograph of me. Taken outside my apartment building just 2 days earlier, showing me loading my exploration gear into my backpack. They had been watching me, planning for me. This wasn't a chance encounter, they had known I was coming. I was so absorbed in studying the photographs that I didn't immediately notice when the humming of the servers stopped. It was only when the silence registered that I realized all the equipment in the room had powered down simultaneously. The displays went dark, the status lights extinguished, and even the ventilation system fell silent. In the sudden quiet, I could hear voices much more clearly now. Not just the 2 people in the anteroom, but others, speaking in languages I couldn't identify. And underneath their conversation, a new sound that made my skin crawl, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass, coming from somewhere deeper in the facility. That's when the lights went out completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could find it, I heard something that made me freeze completely. The sound of my own voice, crystal clear and perfectly reproduced, coming from speakers hidden somewhere in the room. "My name is Marcus Delacroix, and I've spent the better part of 15 years documenting Montreal's hidden urban infrastructure." It was a recording from my latest blog post, the one where I had discussed my plans for exploring the pneumatic postal tunnels. But it wasn't just playing back my words, it was mixing them with other audio, creating new sentences that I had never spoken. "I know about the missing people. I know about the experiments. I know about the screams in the tunnels." The recorded voice continued, describing knowledge I didn't possess, confessing to discoveries I had never made, implicating me in activities I knew nothing about. Someone had been collecting my voice from my video blogs, from podcast interviews, from anywhere I had ever been recorded, and they were using it to construct evidence of crimes I had never committed. The tapping sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't fingernails on glass. It was something trying to get out from behind the walls, something that had heard my voice, real or fabricated, and was responding to it. I finally found my flashlight and switched it on, but the beam seemed weaker than before, barely penetrating the darkness that had settled over the room like a living thing. In the weak light, I could see that the wall of photographs had changed. New pictures had appeared, recent ones, showing me entering the building tonight, making my way through the tunnels, even standing in the ritual chamber moments before I had been spotted. But in the center of the wall, where my photograph had been, there was now something else. A mirror, reflecting my face back at me, but wrong somehow. The reflection showed me as I was, standing in the computer room with my flashlight, but my reflected eyes were completely black, and my mouth was moving, forming words I wasn't speaking. The tapping behind the walls became a frantic scratching, and I could hear something else now. Muffled voices calling my name, pleading for help, begging me to let them out. Voices that sounded familiar, though I couldn't place them in my panic state. And then, from the anteroom behind me, I heard the sound of multiple footsteps approaching the glass partition. Not just the two people who had been there before, but many more. They moved with that same unsettling synchronization I had heard during my flight through the tunnels, and as they approached, they began to hum that low, vibrating tone that seemed to resonate in my bones. I looked around desperately for another exit, another passage that might lead away from this nightmare facility. In the corner of the room, barely visible in my flashlight beam, I could see what looked like a maintenance access panel. It was slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond, but it represented the only escape route I could find. As I moved toward it, the voices behind the walls grew more insistent, more desperate. They were calling my name now, pleading with me not to leave them, telling me they had been waiting so long for someone to find them. The voices of the missing, the disappeared, the people whose screams had echoed through these tunnels for months or years. I reached the access panel just as the glass partition behind me shattered. Through the opening, I could see them clearly now, the same hooded figures from the ritual chamber, but also others wearing the surgical masks and modern clothing I had seen on the monitors. They moved as a single organism, flowing into the computer room like a tide of darkness, their humming growing louder and more complex, harmonizing in ways that hurt to hear. And behind them, floating just above their heads like some kind of impossible projection, was my own face, mouth moving in perfect synchronization with words I could hear but couldn't understand, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. I squeezed through the access panel and found myself in a maintenance crawlway that seemed to extend in multiple directions. Behind me, I could hear them trying to follow, but the opening was too small for multiple pursuers. I had gained a temporary advantage, but I knew it wouldn't last long. The crawlway was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits that left little room to maneuver. I crawled as quickly as I could, following what seemed to be the most direct route away from the facility, guided only by the weak beam of my flashlight and in desperate hope that this passage would eventually lead to the surface. But as I crawled, I became aware that I wasn't alone in the crawlway. There were other sounds, other movements, coming from the darkness ahead of me. Something was in there with me, something that had been waiting in the narrow spaces between the walls, something that had heard my voice calling for help and had decided to answer. And from somewhere far above me, filtering down through tons of concrete and steel, I could hear a sound that confirmed my worst fears, the screams I had heard earlier, but multiplied now, a chorus of agony that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The missing people weren't missing. They were still here, somewhere in this underground complex, and they had been screaming for a very long time. The thing in the crawlway ahead of me wasn't moving like a person. It scraped and slithered through the narrow space with a wet, organic sound that made my stomach turn. Whatever it was, it had once been human. I could hear the remnants of speech mixed in with the scraping, broken syllables that might have once been words, now reduced to mindless repetition of sounds that held no meaning. I tried to back away, but behind me I could hear the hooded figures attempting to force their way into the maintenance access. Metal groaned and concrete cracked as they worked to widen the opening, their synchronized humming now accompanied by what sounded like power tools. They would reach me soon, and whatever was ahead of me in the crawlway would reach me sooner. That's when I noticed the vertical shaft. My flashlight beam caught a section where the crawlway intersected with what appeared to be an old ventilation duct that led upward. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and when I shined my light up the shaft, I could see that it continued for at least 30 feet before disappearing into darkness. More importantly, I could feel a slight current of air flowing down from above, air that carried the scent of the city, of exhaust and snow and the thousand small odors of the surface world. The scraping sound was getting closer, accompanied now by a voice that I recognized despite its deteriorated state. It was Jean-Luc, the contractor who had given me access to the building. But his voice was wrong, broken, speaking in fragments that suggested his mind had been shattered into pieces. "Marcus, down here, so long, they made me, the sounds, please make it stop, can't remember, surface, what was, help me." I realized with growing horror that Jean-Luc hadn't simply given me access to the tunnels out of professional courtesy. He had been part of this from the beginning, either willingly or as another victim who had been down here long enough to lose his grasp on reality. The wet sounds accompanying his voice suggested that whatever had been done to him in this place had affected more than just his mind. Behind me, the sound of the hooded figures breaking through the access panel grew louder. I could hear concrete chunks hitting the floor of the computer room, and the synchronized humming was taking on a triumphant quality that made my skin crawl. I had seconds to make a choice. I grabbed the edges of the vertical shaft and hauled myself up. The climb was brutal. The shaft was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the metal walls were slick with condensation that made every handhold treacherous. My exploration gear caught on protruding rivets and ventilation grates, forcing me to abandon my camera bag and most of my equipment to continue upward. Only my flashlight and my desperate need to reach the surface kept me moving. Below me, I could hear Jean-Luc's broken voice calling my name, pleading with me not to leave him alone with them. The sound echoed up the shaft, mixing with the humming of the pursuers who had now entered the crawlway. But worse than either of those sounds was what I began to hear from above, a rhythmic banging, like someone pounding on metal with their fists, accompanied by screaming that grew louder as I climbed higher. The shaft connected to a horizontal duct system about 20 feet up, and I gratefully pulled myself into the wider space to rest my aching arms and shoulders. The air here was warmer and carried stronger scents from the surface world, cooking food, car exhaust, and the distinctive smell of Montreal's winter air. I was getting closer to escape. But the banging and screaming were much louder now, coming from somewhere very close. As I oriented myself in the horizontal duct, I realized the sounds were coming from branching passages that connected to other parts of the building's ventilation system. And they weren't random noises. They followed patterns, rhythms that suggested some form of communication. Morse code. I had learned it years ago for a story I was researching about wartime communications in Montreal, and though I was rusty, I could still recognize the basic patterns. The banging from the nearest duct was spelling out words. "Help us please, trapped so long." Other ducts picked up the pattern, adding their own messages. "Can't get out, they watch us. Forget our names, forget who we were." The missing people weren't just alive, they were imprisoned throughout the building's ventilation system, trapped in spaces too small to move freely but large enough to keep them alive. For how long, I couldn't imagine, but long enough for some of them to lose their identities, their memories, everything that had once made them human. I tried to respond, tapping out a message on the duct wall with my flashlight. 𝒕𝒉𝒆𝒂𝒓. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every connected duct began banging at once, a cacophony of messages that overlapped and interrupted each other. 𝒕𝒉𝒆𝒂𝒓. BILDINGSTUNNELSSUBWYTHUYMOVUS. CNTDIETGYWNTLETUSKPUSALID. That last message made my blood freeze. They weren't just imprisoning people, they were keeping them alive indefinitely, trapped in spaces barely large enough for a human body, scattered throughout Montreal's underground infrastructure like some nightmarish network of living storage. From below, I could hear the sounds of my pursuers entering the vertical shaft. Their synchronized humming echoed up the metal walls, creating harmonics that seemed designed to disorient and confuse. But mixed in with their sounds was Jean-Luc's voice, still calling my name, still pleading for help, and now I understood that he wasn't one of them. He was another victim, probably one of the earliest, broken by years of imprisonment and torture until they could use him as bait for others. I forced myself to continue through the horizontal duct, following the strongest current of outside air. The Morse code messages continued around me, but they were changing, becoming more urgent, more desperate. TCYCOMINGFORYUGTOUTWARNPUPLE. DONDLTTCMTKYUTOLATFRUS. RUN. The duct system was more complex than I had expected, branching and connecting in ways that suggested it served multiple buildings. As I crawled through the passages, guided by the flow of outside air and the increasingly strong sense of the surface world, I began to understand the true scope of what I had discovered. This wasn't just one building, one group of cultists, one isolated horror. The network extended throughout the underground infrastructure of Montreal, connecting buildings, tunnels, subway stations, and probably every major structure in the downtown core. The missing people weren't just disappearing, they were being integrated into the city itself, becoming part of the infrastructure, living components in some vast and incomprehensible system. I reached a section where the duct connected to what appeared to be a more modern ventilation system. Through a grate, I could see a familiar-looking basement, concrete walls, exposed pipes, the kind of utilitarian space that existed beneath every major building in the city. But more importantly, I could see daylight filtering down from a stairwell at the far end of the room. The grate was held in place by 4 screws, but years of condensation had rusted them enough that I was able to work them loose with the edge of my flashlight. As I removed the last screw, the banging from the ducts around me suddenly stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like a hell breath, and in that silence, I could hear something that chilled me to the bone. Footsteps. Multiple sets, moving in perfect synchronization, coming from every direction at once. Not just from the duct system I had been crawling through, but from the basement below, from the floors above, from corridors and passages I couldn't see. They had been tracking my movement through the building's infrastructure, and now they were converging on my location. I dropped through the grate into the basement and ran for the stairwell. Behind me, I could hear grates being kicked out all throughout the building as figures dropped from the ventilation system in pursuit. But these weren't the hooded cultists from the tunnel. These were people in normal clothes, looking like office workers and maintenance staff and security guards, all moving with that same unnatural synchronization. The stairwell was a narrow concrete passage that led upward in a series of switchbacks. As I climbed, taking the steps 3 at a time, I could see that each floor I passed was lit and occupied. Through the small windows in the stairwell doors, I caught glimpses of normal-looking offices, people working at desks, meetings and conference rooms. But everyone I saw moved with that same synchronized quality, and when they turned to look at the stairwell doors, their eyes reflected the light like an animal's. I reached the ground floor and burst through the exit into what I recognized as the lobby of a major office building in the financial district. The space was clean and modern, with marble floors and huge windows that looked out onto the snow-covered street. It was past midnight, but the building was fully occupied, filled with hundreds of people conducting what appeared to be normal business activities. But as I ran across the lobby toward the street doors, every person in the building stopped what they were doing and turned to look at me. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, computer keyboards fell silent, even the elevators stopped moving. The silence was absolute, and in that silence, I could hear the sound that had haunted me since the tunnel, that low, synchronized humming, now coming from hundreds of throats at once. I hit the emergency exit bar on the street doors with enough force to set off alarms throughout the building. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow, but I had never been so grateful to feel winter wind on my face. I stumbled out onto the sidewalk, gasping and shaking, finally free of the nightmare I had discovered beneath the city. But as I stood there in the falling snow, trying to process what had happened, I became aware that something was wrong with the street around me. It was too quiet. Montreal's downtown core is never completely silent, even in the early hours of the morning. There's always traffic, always some sign of life. But the street was empty except for me, and the only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the soft whisper of snow falling on concrete. That's when I noticed the footprints in the fresh snow. They led away from every building on the block, converging at manholes, disappearing down storm drains, tracing paths to maintenance entrances and utility access points. Hundreds of sets of footprints, all made by people leaving the surface world and descending into the tunnels below. And every set was perfectly aligned, as if everyone had walked in exactly the same rhythm, with exactly the same stride length, moving in perfect unison toward the underground network that spread beneath the city like a circulatory system. I looked back at the building I had just escaped from, and through the huge lobby windows, I could see them all still standing there, still watching me. But now I could see that they weren't just in the lobby, they filled every floor, every window, hundreds upon hundreds of people, all standing perfectly still, all facing outward, all looking down at me with those reflective, inhuman eyes. And slowly, in perfect synchronization, they all began to smile. That's when I realized the truth that has haunted me for the past 18 months. I hadn't discovered some isolated cult or criminal organization hiding in Montreal's tunnels. I had discovered that Montreal itself was the organization. The missing people hadn't been taken, they had been converted, integrated into something that was using the city's infrastructure like a nervous system, coordinating the actions of thousands of people in a pattern too vast for any individual mind to comprehend. And now they knew that I knew. I ran through the empty streets as behind me, every building began to hum. The humming followed me through the financial district like a living thing, emanating from every structure I passed. Office buildings, hotels, even the old stone churches, they all vibrated with that low, synchronized tone that seemed to resonate in my bones. The sound grew stronger as more buildings joined the chorus, creating harmonics that made the very air feel thick and oppressive. I didn't stop running until I reached the old port, my lungs burning from the cold air and exertion. Behind me, the downtown core had become a symphony of architectural voices, each building contributing to a sound that was definitely not made by wind or settling foundations. The snow continued to fall, but now it seemed to be falling in patterns, accumulating in lines and symbols that looked disturbingly familiar, the same markings I had seen carved into the tunnel walls. My apartment was in Plateau Montreal, miles away from downtown, but I didn't dare take the metro. If the network extended throughout the city's infrastructure, the subway system would be compromised too. Instead, I caught the last night bus, huddling in a seat near the back and trying to look like just another late-night worker heading home. The bus was nearly empty, just myself, the driver, and 3 other passengers spread throughout the seats. Normal-looking people, quietly minding their own business. But as we pulled away from the downtown core, I noticed that all 3 passengers were breathing in perfect synchronization. And when the bus turned a corner, causing everyone to shift slightly in their seats, they all moved at exactly the same moment, compensating for the motion with identical adjustments. I got off at the next stop. The walk home took me through neighborhoods I had known for 15 years, streets where I had conducted dozens of urban exploration adventures. But tonight, everything felt different. House lights were on in windows that should have been dark, and in those lit windows, I could see silhouettes of people standing perfectly still, all facing the street. Not looking at anything in particular, just standing there, waiting. My apartment building looked normal enough from the outside, but when I reached my floor, I found my neighbor Mrs. Rousseau standing in her doorway. She was an elderly woman who kept to herself, and I had never seen her outside her apartment past 9 in the evening. Now she stood motionless in her nightgown, staring directly at my door with those same reflective eyes I had seen in the office building. "Bonsoir, Marcus," she said without looking at me as I fumbled with my keys. Her voice had the same broken quality I had heard from Jean-Luc in the tunnels. "We've been waiting for you to come home." I got my door open and slammed it behind me, throwing the deadbolt and the chain lock. But even as I did, I could hear other doors opening throughout the building, footsteps in the hallways, and that low humming beginning again, this time coming from the walls around me. My apartment felt like a sanctuary for exactly 30 seconds. Then I noticed that my computer was on, though I distinctly remembered shutting it down before leaving for the exploration. The screen showed my blog, Beneath the Surface, but the latest post wasn't one I had written. Instead, there was a detailed account of everything I had experienced in the tunnels, complete with photographs I had never taken and descriptions of events I had never witnessed. According to the blog post, I had been exploring Montreal's underground network for months, documenting the disappearances and the strange modifications to the city's infrastructure. The post described rituals I had supposedly observed, people I had allegedly spoken to, and discoveries I had never made. It was my voice, my writing style, but describing experiences that belonged to someone else, or something else. The post was dated 3 months ago. I scrolled through the other recent entries on my blog, and found months of content I had never created. Stories about finding hidden chambers filled with advanced technology, interviews with people who claimed to have been upgraded to serve the network, detailed maps of tunnel systems that I had never explored. All written in my voice, all tagged with my byline, all presenting a version of my life where I had been willingly collaborating with whatever was living beneath the city. But the most disturbing part was the comments section. Hundreds of responses from other urban explorers, journalists, and city officials, all discussing my discoveries, as if they were common knowledge. People I had never met thanking me for my courage in exposing the truth. Government officials promising to investigate the locations I had mapped. Other bloggers sharing their own experiences with what they called the integration. According to the digital record, Montreal's transformation hadn't been secret at all. It had been thoroughly documented, widely discussed, and apparently accepted by everyone except me. I tried to delete the posts, but found that I had been locked out of my own accounts. Not just the blog, but my email, my social media, even my banking information. According to every digital system in the city, Marcus Delacroix had been actively participating in Montreal's underground network for months. My credit cards showed purchases of equipment I had never bought, transactions at locations I had never visited, payments to organizations I had never heard of. The humming from the walls was getting louder, and I could hear movement in the apartments above and below mine. Footsteps moving in perfect synchronization, crossing back and forth in patterns that suggested some kind of coordinated activity. Through my windows, I could see that every building on my block was now fully lit, every window filled with silhouettes of people standing and watching the street. I grabbed my emergency bag, something every urban explorer keeps packed with basic supplies, and headed for the fire escape. But as I opened the window, I found myself face to face with my upstairs neighbor, Mr. Chen, who was standing on the fire escape landing directly above my window. He was wearing the same clothes he had been wearing that morning when I passed him in the lobby, but now his eyes reflected the light like mirrors. "The network needs you to come home, Marcus," he said in a voice that didn't quite match his usual accent. "You've been away too long. Your integration is overdue." I slammed the windows shut and backed away, but I could see more figures moving on the fire escapes of neighboring buildings. They were all facing my apartment, all waiting with that inhuman patience I had witnessed throughout the night. The humming stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. In that silence, I could hear something else, my own voice, coming from the walls themselves, speaking words I had never said. Day 127 of integration. The process is proceeding normally. Subject shows expected resistance patterns, but compliance markers are within acceptable parameters. Physical modifications have been successful. Mental restructuring at 73% completion. Network integration should be complete within 48 hours. It was my voice, but older somehow, tired, as if recorded after months of stress and exhaustion. And it was coming from inside the walls, suggesting that somewhere in my building's infrastructure, there was equipment that had been recording and analyzing me for months without my knowledge. The voice continued. Subject has successfully mapped primary access points and documented key personnel. Cover story of accidental discovery has been maintained effectively. Other urban exploration contacts have been identified and preliminary surveillance has begun. Expansion into community is proceeding ahead of schedule. I realized with growing horror that I hadn't discovered their network by accident. I had been led there, guided through months of careful manipulation to the exact moment when they needed me to see what I had seen. Every choice I had made, every route I had planned, every decision that had led me into those tunnels had been orchestrated to serve their purposes. But what were their purposes? The answer came in my own voice, continuing its report from inside the walls. Integration of Montreal infrastructure now at 78% completion. Network has successfully infiltrated municipal government, utilities management, transportation systems, and communications infrastructure. Population compliance remains high, with voluntary participation exceeding projections. Expansion into neighboring cities will commence once Montreal integration reaches 85%. Montreal wasn't just being invaded or infected. It was being upgraded, transformed into something that could serve as a model for other cities. And I hadn't been fighting against this process. According to the evidence, I had been helping to document and facilitate it. The silence broke as every electronic device in my apartment came to life simultaneously. My television, radio, computer, even my old alarm clock began displaying the same message in multiple languages. Integration complete. Return to network. Resistance is inefficient. That's when I heard the footsteps in my hallway. Not the synchronized walking I had been hearing all night, but normal, individual footsteps. Someone was approaching my door with the casual gait of a person coming home after a long day. The footsteps stopped outside my apartment, and I heard the sound of keys being inserted into my locks. My keys. Someone was using my keys to enter my apartment. The locks turned, and the door opened to reveal myself. Not someone who looked like me, not a disguise or a mask, but me. Same height, same build, same face, even wearing the clothes I had put on that morning. The only difference was the eyes. They reflected light like polished metal. And they looked at me with an expression of patient condescension. "Hello, Marcus," my duplicate said, stepping into the apartment and closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." I backed away until I hit the far wall, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The duplicate moved with casual familiarity through my apartment, picking up objects and examining them as if seeing them for the first time in months. "You're probably wondering how this is possible," he said, settling into my favorite chair. "The answer is simpler than you think. We've been growing you for quite some time now. Every time you entered our network, every time you breathed our air or touched our surfaces, you left behind genetic material. Skin cells, hair follicles, DNA sequences that we could study and replicate. The hard part wasn't creating your body. It was downloading your memories, your personality patterns, your speech mannerisms. That took months of careful observation." He gestured to the walls around us. "Every surface in this building has been equipped with sensors and recording devices. We've been studying you, Marcus, learning how you think, how you react, how you make decisions. We needed to create a perfect copy, one that could take over your life without anyone noticing the difference." "But why?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The duplicate smiled with my face. "Because you're famous in certain circles, Marcus. Your blog, your documentation work, your reputation as an honest researcher, these things have value. When Marcus Delacroix writes about Montreal's transformation, people believe him. When he tells the world that the integration is voluntary, beneficial, evolutionary, people listen." He stood up and walked to my computer, where my falsified blog posts were still displayed. "You're going to help us expand to other cities. Toronto first, then Vancouver, then south to New York and Boston. Your documentation of Montreal's success will serve as a template, showing other communities how they can voluntarily upgrade their infrastructure to join our network." "And what happens to me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Oh, you'll be integrated, of course," the duplicate said cheerfully. "Your consciousness will be preserved within the network, contributing your knowledge and experience to the collective. Think of it as immortality, your thoughts and memories living forever as part of something infinitely larger than any individual human mind." Through my windows, I could see that the street outside was no longer empty. Hundreds of people were gathering, all moving in perfect synchronization, all converging on my building. They looked like normal Montreal citizens, office workers, students, elderly couples, families with children, but they all moved with that same unified purpose, and their eyes all reflected the light in the same inhuman way. "The process is quite painless," my duplicate continued. "A few hours of neural mapping, some minor surgical modifications to install the necessary interfaces, and then you'll be connected to the most advanced consciousness network ever created. You'll have access to the combined knowledge and experience of thousands of minds, Marcus. Imagine what you could discover, what you could document, with that kind of collective intelligence." "What about free will?" I asked. "What about choice?" The duplicate looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Free will is inefficient, Marcus. Individual choice leads to conflict, waste, suffering. Our network eliminates these problems by ensuring that everyone works toward common goals. You've seen the results. Montreal is cleaner, safer, more productive than it's ever been. Crime has virtually disappeared, unemployment is non-existent, and citizens report higher levels of satisfaction than any other city in North America. He was right, I realized. For months, I had noticed that Montreal seemed to be running more smoothly than usual. Street repairs were completed faster, public transportation ran on time, even the weather seemed more cooperative. I had attributed it to good municipal management. But now I understood it was something far more systematic. "We're not conquerors, Marcus," the duplicate said, as if reading my thoughts. "We're upgraders. We take struggling, chaotic human systems and optimize them. Individual humans are limited by biology, by emotion, by the inefficient processing power of single brains. But connected to our network, they become part of something magnificent, a distributed consciousness that can solve problems no individual mind could even comprehend." The footsteps in the hallway were growing louder, and I could hear the sound of people climbing the stairs. The integration team was coming for me, and I had nowhere left to run. But as the duplicate continued explaining the benefits of assimilation, I noticed something he had missed in his perfect replication of my mannerisms. He wasn't fidgeting. In 15 years of urban exploration, I had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking my equipment, adjusting straps, touching my pockets to make sure everything was secure. It was an unconscious behavior that I did without thinking. The duplicate sat perfectly still, with a stillness that no nervous human could maintain. And that gave me an idea. "You're right," I said, moving slowly toward my equipment bag. "The network does sound fascinating. I'd love to document the integration process from the inside. Could I record some notes before we begin? For historical purposes?" The duplicate's eyes brightened, or rather, reflected more light. "Of course. Your documentation of the integration experience could be invaluable for encouraging voluntary participation in other cities." I reached into my equipment bag and pulled out what looked like a small recording device. But urban explorers learned to be resourceful, and what the duplicate saw as a digital recorder was actually an emergency flare, the kind used by cave explorers and tunnel workers when they need to signal for rescue. "This should capture everything," I said, and pulled the ignition cord. The flare erupted in a burst of white-hot light that filled the apartment like a miniature sun. The duplicate screamed, the first genuinely human sound he had made, and fell backward, his reflective eyes unable to process the sudden intensity of the light. But more importantly, the flare's chemical composition included compounds that were toxic to most forms of organic technology, and I could see smoke rising from his skin where the chemicals in the air made contact. I didn't wait to see if the damage was permanent. I grabbed my emergency bag and ran for the window, kicking it open and scrambling onto the fire escape. Mr. Chin was still standing on the landing above, but the flare's light had affected him too. He stood motionless and unresponsive, smoke rising from his eyes like tiny chimneys. I climbed down the fire escape as quickly as I could, the flare still burning in my apartment above, casting wild shadows across the building facades. Behind me, I could hear my duplicate recovering, calling out in my own voice for the integration teams to intercept me. But I had one advantage they couldn't replicate. I knew Montreal's underground better than anyone, and I knew routes that weren't part of the official infrastructure, storm drains and utility tunnels that predated their network, passages too old and forgotten to have been integrated into their system. At least, I hoped they were too old. As I reached the street level, I could see the crowds of synchronized people converging on my building from every direction. But I also noticed something else. The emergency flare had triggered some kind of cascade reaction in the neighborhood. Street lights were flickering, electronic signs were malfunctioning, and several of the synchronized figures were moving erratically, as if their coordination had been disrupted. The network had a weakness. It could be disrupted by the right kind of interference, at least temporarily. And I knew exactly where to find the tools I would need to exploit that weakness. The old electronics district, abandoned for decades but still containing warehouses full of obsolete equipment that the network would never have bothered to monitor or integrate. If I could reach it, if I could find the right components, I might be able to build something that could disrupt their control on a larger scale. But first, I had to survive the next few hours in a city that was actively hunting me. As I disappeared into the storm drain system beneath Plateau Montreal, I could hear the sound of hundreds of footsteps above me, all moving in perfect synchronization, all searching for the one person in Montreal who was no longer part of their network. The chase was just beginning. The storm drains beneath Plateau Montreal were older than the network's infrastructure, dating back to the early 1900s when Montreal's rapid expansion required massive engineering projects to manage water flow. These tunnels had been my refuge during countless explorations, and I knew their layout better than any city engineer. More importantly, they were built with materials and techniques that predated modern electronics, pure stone and brick construction that couldn't be easily modified to support the network's surveillance systems. At least, that's what I hoped. I made my way through the familiar passages, using my backup flashlight to navigate the ankle-deep water that flowed constantly through the main channels. The sound of the city above was muted here, replaced by the steady drip of condensation and the distant rush of water moving through larger pipes. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could think clearly. But that feeling didn't last long. About 20 minutes into my underground journey, I began to hear sounds that didn't belong in the storm drain system. The synchronized footsteps were back, but now they were coming from multiple directions, ahead of me, behind me, and from side passages I had thought were too narrow for human travel. The network had found ways into the old infrastructure after all, or worse, had been modifying it gradually over months or years without anyone noticing. I pressed myself against the wall of a wider chamber and switched off my flashlight, listening to the footsteps approach. In the darkness, I could hear them more clearly now, not just the synchronized walking, but also a sound that made my skin crawl. They were dragging things through the water, heavy objects that scraped against the stone floor with each step. Bodies. They were bringing bodies into the storm drains. The footsteps passed my hiding place without stopping, but in the brief moments when their lights swept past the chamber entrance, I caught glimpses of what they were carrying. Not corpses, that would have been almost a relief, but people who were still alive, still conscious, but completely paralyzed. Their eyes tracked the movement of light across the tunnel ceiling, wide with terror and awareness, but they couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but be dragged deeper into the network's underground domain. Fresh recruits for integration. I waited until the sounds faded before continuing, but now I knew I was racing against time. The network wasn't just hunting me, it was actively expanding, bringing new people into the tunnels every hour. How many disappeared every night? How many people went to sleep in their beds and woke up strapped to tables in underground chambers, waiting for neuromodifications that would rob them of everything that made them human? The old electronics district was still 3 miles away through tunnels that were increasingly compromised. But I had another option, one that the network couldn't have anticipated because it wasn't part of any official city infrastructure. During the construction of the metro system in the 1960s, workers had broken through into a series of natural caves that extended beneath the eastern part of the city. Rather than incorporate the caves into the subway design, city planners had simply sealed them off and built around them. But urban explorers had found ways in over the decades, and I knew of at least 2 access points that connected the cave system to the storm drains. The caves were older than human civilization, carved by water and geological processes that stretched back millions of years. If any part of Montreal's underground was free from the network's influence, it would be there. I found the access point I was looking for in a maintenance chamber about a mile from my apartment. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall that looked like solid concrete, but was actually a thin facade covering a natural opening in the limestone bedrock. I had discovered it 5 years earlier and had used it to explore some of the most pristine underground formations in the region. The cave system beyond was everything I had hoped, completely natural, untouched by human modification, and blissfully silent. No humming, no synchronized footsteps, no electronic surveillance. Just the sound of water moving through stone passages and the whisper of air currents that had been flowing through these chambers for millennia. But I wasn't the only one who had found refuge in the caves. About half a mile into the system, in a large chamber that I had always thought was uninhabited, I found them. Dozens of people, maybe 100, huddled around small fires and makeshift shelters. They looked like refugees from a war zone, dirty, exhausted, haunted by experiences they couldn't fully articulate. But their eyes were human, reflecting light the way human eyes should, and when they looked at me, I saw recognition and hope instead of that inhuman patience I had witnessed throughout the night. "Are you real?" asked a woman who approached me cautiously. She was maybe 30 years old, wearing clothes that had once been professional attire but were now stained and torn. "Or are you one of them, testing us?" "I'm real," I said, though after everything I had experienced, I wasn't entirely sure what that meant anymore. "Are you refugees from the network?" The woman nodded, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. "We've been down here for weeks, some of us for months. We're the ones who got away, or who never fully integrated, or who the process didn't work on properly. There are others hiding throughout the cave system, but we don't know how many." She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, Mr. Chen's daughter, I realized, the neighbor I had seen on the fire escape. She was a neurologist who had been working at Montreal General Hospital when she started noticing unusual patterns in her patients. Brain scans that showed modifications that shouldn't have been possible, surgical scarring that appeared overnight, and behavioral changes that suggested some form of external neural control. "I started investigating," she said, leading me to a quieter area of the chamber where we could talk without disturbing the other refugees. "I found medical records showing that thousands of people had been admitted for routine procedures that weren't routine at all. Brain surgery, neural implants, modifications to the nervous system that were far beyond anything our hospital was equipped to perform. When I tried to report it to the authorities, I discovered that they were already part of the network. Police, city officials, hospital administrators, they all showed the same behavioral patterns, the same synchronized responses. That's when I realized the scope of what was happening. Dr. Chen had managed to escape during her own scheduled integration, warning as many people as she could before fleeing to the caves. Some of the other refugees had similar stories: medical professionals, city workers, journalists who had gotten too close to the truth and had been marked for assimilation. But the most disturbing revelation came from a man named David Tremblay, a former electronics engineer who had worked on Montreal's communications infrastructure. He had been partially integrated before escaping, retaining some connection to the network that allowed him to understand how it functioned. "It's not just Montreal," he told me, his hands shaking as he spoke. "The network extends to other cities, other countries. What we're seeing here is just one node in a global system that's been growing for decades. The technology isn't human, it's something else, something that's been studying us and learning how to optimize human societies." He showed me crude diagrams he had drawn on the cave walls, mapping out what he understood of the network structure. "They don't see themselves as invaders. To them, we're just inefficient biological computers that need upgrading. Individual consciousness is wasteful, chaotic, prone to error. By connecting human brains to their distributed network, they can eliminate suffering, conflict, and inefficiency. But they also eliminate choice," Dr. Chen added. "Free will, creativity, the ability to love or dream or hope for something better. We become components in a machine, processing information and following directives without question." I told them about my discovery in the tunnels, about the duplicate that had been created to replace me, and about the emergency flare that had disrupted the network's control. David's eyes lit up when I described the cascade effect I had witnessed. "That's it," he said excitedly. "That's their weakness. The network relies on synchronized neural oscillations to maintain control over integrated individuals. If we could generate the right kind of electromagnetic interference, we might be able to disrupt their coordination on a much larger scale." He began sketching frantically on the cave wall. "The old electronics district you mentioned, there should be equipment there we could use. Radio transmitters, signal generators, maybe even some of the old radar equipment from the airport. If we could modify it to broadcast at specific frequencies, we might be able to break the network's hold on the integrated population. At least temporarily." Dr. Chen cautioned. The network would adapt, find ways to shield against the interference. We'd have a window of opportunity, but not much more. A window might be enough, I said. If we could wake up enough people, even for a few hours, maybe we could organize some kind of resistance. But David shook his head. You don't understand the scope of this. The network has been integrating people for years, maybe decades. Most of Montreal's population is already connected. Even if we could disrupt their control, what would happen to all those people when their neuromodifications suddenly stopped working? Some of them might die from the shock. The moral implications hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just talking about defeating an invasion. We were talking about potentially killing thousands of innocent people who had been transformed against their will. The network had created a situation where resistance might be more harmful than surrender. There's another option, Dr. Chen said quietly. We could try to establish contact with networks in other cities, warn them about what's happening here. If Montreal is just one node in a larger system, maybe other cities are still free. Maybe we could coordinate a global response. Or maybe we're the last free humans on Earth, David said grimly. Maybe every major city has already been integrated, and we're just too isolated down here to know it. The possibility hung in the air between us like a death sentence. If the network's reach was truly global, if we were fighting something that had already won everywhere else, then our resistance was meaningless. We would be the last humans in a world of optimized, synchronized beings who had given up their individual consciousness for the promise of efficiency and harmony. But as I looked around the cave at the refugees who had chosen suffering and uncertainty over assimilation, I realized that the choice itself mattered more than the outcome. These people had decided that human consciousness, flawed, chaotic, inefficient as it might be, was worth preserving even if it meant living in darkness and fear. We tried both approaches, I decided. David, you and I will attempt to reach the electronics district and build a disruptor device. Dr. Chen, can you organize the refugees to establish communication with other cities? Even if we can't stop the network, we need to document what happened here. Future generations need to know that some humans chose to remain human. We spent the next several hours planning our mission. The cave system extended almost to the electronics district, but the final approach would require traveling through tunnels that were certainly under network surveillance. We would have to move carefully, avoiding the synchronized patrols and the integration teams that were constantly bringing new victims into the underground chambers. But as we prepared to leave the relative safety of the caves, I realized that something had changed in the hours we had been planning. The sounds from the tunnels above had grown quieter, and the constant low-frequency humming that had been audible even in the caves had stopped entirely. Dr. Chen noticed it too. Something's happening up there, she said. The network activity has changed dramatically in the last hour. David looked troubled. Maybe they've completed their integration of Montreal. Maybe there's no one left to hunt. Or maybe, I thought but didn't say aloud, they had decided that a few dozen refugees hiding in caves weren't worth the effort to pursue. Maybe they were moving on to other cities, other populations, leaving Montreal as a perfectly synchronized model of their vision for human society. The possibility that we might emerge from the caves to find a city full of content, optimized, efficiently functioning people who would look at us with pity for clinging to our chaotic human consciousness was almost worse than the idea of being hunted. But we had made our choice. Whatever waited for us on the surface, we would face it as the last free humans of Montreal, carrying the memory of what we had once been and the hope that somewhere, somehow, true human consciousness would survive. As David and I prepared to leave for the electronics district, Dr. Chen handed me a small device she had cobbled together from medical equipment. It's a neural activity monitor, she explained. If you start showing signs of network integration, synchronized brainwave patterns, loss of individual thought processes, it will alert you. The process isn't always immediate. Sometimes they can influence you gradually, making you think their thoughts are your own ideas. I clipped the device to my belt, another reminder of how completely the network had infiltrated every aspect of human existence. Even our thoughts were no longer entirely our own. The journey through the final stretch of caves was silent except for the sound of water moving through stone. But as we approached the access point that would take us back into Montreal's underground infrastructure, I could hear something that made me stop in my tracks. Music. Not the synchronized humming or the electronic tones I had come to associate with the network, but actual music. Classical compositions, jazz standards, folk songs, a mixture of human musical expression broadcasting from speakers hidden throughout the tunnel system. And mixed in with the music, I could hear something even more impossible. Laughter. Human laughter, spontaneous and chaotic, echoing through the tunnels in patterns that no synchronized network could produce. The sound of people enjoying themselves, being surprised, finding joy in unexpected moments. Either the network had learned to simulate human happiness with terrifying accuracy, or something had changed in Montreal while we were hiding in the caves. David and I looked at each other, both thinking the same impossible thought. Maybe we had already won. Maybe the network had collapsed on its own, or been defeated by forces we knew nothing about, or simply decided to abandon Montreal in favor of easier targets. Or maybe this was just another layer of the trap, designed to draw out the last remaining free humans with the promise of liberation. There was only one way to find out. As we climbed toward the surface, toward whatever version of Montreal awaited us, I realized that this moment, this choice to continue hoping despite overwhelming evidence that hope was foolish, might be the most essentially human thing any of us would ever do. The music grew louder as we climbed, and underneath it, I could hear the sound of individual voices, calling to each other across distances, making plans, arguing, laughing, crying, expressing the full spectrum of human emotion in all its beautiful, inefficient chaos. Whether it was real or illusion, resistance or surrender, I climbed toward it anyway. Because 18 months later, as I write this account, I still believe that the choice to remain human, whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, is the only choice that matters. Even if I'm the only one left who remembers what that choice means.